Thank you very, very much. Our last speaker on the industry is Wandile Sihlobo. Wandile, I know you now as the go-to person when it comes to agricultural economy, and I know for a fact that the Minister also makes use of you on a regular basis. Thank you very much. We would like to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon to everyone that is online. I know I'm standing between you and dinner or afternoon snacks, and unfortunately, we still have the next 40 minutes to go. I was talking to the technical guys there. They said, no, I can push the envelope a little bit, so you can stretch your legs and get ready for that long session. Hopefully, and thank you also to the other colleagues, because the remarks I will make, they really join in to what the previous speakers have already spoken about. You heard the remarks from Chairman Faber when he was speaking about how the industry standing is looking like. Gerard Francois also on his points. So I will really be joining in there. And what I was asked by Corinne when we talked about the session, she said I could speak about anything that is related to the economy and trying to bring all of the story together. And I almost resisted, as you were seeing me sitting with the mask on, because I also have a bit of a fluish, but I had heard about the CEO's meat pies, which I thought they would also be served in here, but I'm hoping that we will find them somewhere outside. But the 6 points really that I will speak about, because Gerard, you've pulled in all of the industry stuff about how the industry is looking like. So I think I should just maybe tie it on by making the points on the global economy, because at the end of the day, as we are sitting here, we are operating as the industry in the agricultural economy, and the agricultural sector is operating in the economy, and South Africa is part of the world. We might have a relatively small share of the exports for now, but I think everything else that happens in the world does matter a lot to us as the industry. And in my view, or at AgBiz's view, we can really summarize the world economy by those 8 points that you see on the screen. The first one is the issue of the infections. We are sitting nicely in this room. There's no masks a lot. We are well in South Africa, but in other places, there's still all of this COVID thing. And of course, monkeypox is spreading all over. California and the others are declaring it as a bit of a crisis. So I think it's important. And the reason I bring it here is because of the impact on the supply chain, which is number 3 on those blocks that are there. And that matters a lot for the world economy. On how business are doing, what's the cost of doing everything that we see in the world. And I think the issue of invasion, it matters. And for the industry that we are in, when we think about the feed costs and the grain industry and everything that happens in the Ukraine, I still think it's an important stuff when we think about the world economy. It does seem that there are conversations that are happening with all of these grain exports starting to come out, but I think it will last for longer, and that's an important theme we should really be thinking about. But I think the most important one, and which will hit the farmers a lot, is number 4 in there, and nicely linked perhaps with number 5 in those points that are in the screen. Because the rising inflation as a result of all of the disruption that I'm talking about, I think at the core, it ends to that increase in the interest rates. And I think the cost of capital is the one thing that we can all worry about in South Africa. We are sitting, I think, in the agricultural sector that has a farm debt of just under 200 billion rands. And I think if the interest rates are rising aggressively as we see in the world, and I think that's the most important thing that we should worry about. It might seem minimal, but if you were to think about where the interest rates were in 2020 when COVID started, and then we saw the South African Reserve Bank dropping interest rates by roughly 300 basis points. That saved our sector combined around about 6.5 billion rands in debt servicing cost. And I think that's substantial if the interest rates continue to rise aggressively at this point as we see at this moment. And I think the points that Francois spoke about at the start on climate change. He spoke about the effect and the dangers about how that is ending up. But I think the regulations that are being put in place by some of the countries in Europe and the others about how to produce in a crop farming, but of course extending to the livestock and the general consumer view of the industry that we are in is something that we cannot totally ignore, especially in the world market, about how should we be thinking along that perception. It might be true or not as true, just like you saw in the discussion about the genetically modified crops, where they are really help in boosting productivity and protecting the yields and feeding the people. But the perception was that they are bad things that should be taken out and all of those things. So those are the realities about how people should be thinking about these things that I think we should consider in those long-term views that we think about these things. And of course, you mentioned, Gerard, that in the new organization, you'll be looking at the export story. And I think with the deglobalization and the rising protection, those are some of the things that Dewald and the colleagues, as they implement, they will have to be facing some of those realities onto this thing. Let me put this story just very quickly of the inflation stuff that I was talking about and the interest rates. I think the core thing, if you can just look for a moment on that graph, the line that you see dotted in there, that's where the inflation rates in some of those countries were 10-year average. That's the line that we plugged in there. And there's a small dots within those bars. That's the inflation rate last year. At the moment, you have inflation rate in those blue bars that you see there. And the most effective tool that the central banks will be using to control that is, of course, that interest rate story that I was talking about. And I think this is the major threat that we are all really talking about, and many people are worried about on this story. And I think ultimately, all of this links to the growth stuff. You will hear more of the nuance on this when Ferdy and Gerald and the guys at BFEP present the baseline in the coming weeks. But the bottom story is that the world economy is slowing. The demand for meat is one of those things that is also slowing, which is why, Gerard, when you were saying that the local market is so important, and I think it ties in with that story, because in the world, people's money is shrinking, and it will be diverted to other things. If we think of inflation, we think of slowing growth, not only this year, but for the next 3 years or so. There will not be sufficient growth and demand for some of the high-value products in the world market. And I think those are big themes that are out there, but in one way or another, they do have an impact about how as the industry will be performing. And I think the South African story is also really important, because in South Africa, it seems to us, and really many people at the Reserve Bank, at IMF and the others, this year could be better. We could grow over 2%. But for the next 2 or 3 years, the South African economy is likely to grow again at like under 2%. And I think for the environment that is like that, you're likely then going to see a rise in unemployment or remaining at these levels that are over 35%. And there are socio-economical consequences on that, either through strikes or political unrest or whatever that you will see. And as the industry, even if we can do well, in reality is that there is no tree that can thrive in the desert. If outside there, the economy is not well, our sector can only really do well for so long. And I think the points that Gerald you were raising about the next, the roughly 2 million hectares of land or so that is underutilized, which could be used, is very important when we think about low growth. What can agriculture do? And I think the work of BFEP in those 5 pillars, he outlined here one pillar, but there's those 5 pillars for other commodities that can be really useful when we think about the unemployment and the role at which agriculture can pretty much play in saving South Africa onto that. And I think the politicians do get it at that point. You mentioned that we talk to ministers and the others, Mr. CEO, and you are 100% correct on that. They do get the point of the role of agriculture. These are numbers coming out of BFEP and the BER. They kind of pointing exactly why agriculture is important. You're looking at 2010 and to today, and you say, how have we performed? These might not be reflecting in your pockets per se, because the input costs have also been rising at these levels. But the bottom point is that there is growth and activity in this sector, in all of these major subsectors of it, and it speaks to the BFAP presentation, looking back over a decade onto that. But I think the near-term view that you will get from the media about agriculture would likely be negative. At AgBiz, we're looking at 3 to 5% contraction this year. Again, fresh numbers are coming out of the baseline in a week or two. If you watch Fedi and the colleagues when they present that, that will give us a much more accurate picture on this. But I think they will point to a contraction in as far as the agricultural economy activity is concerned this year. But I think that is not something that we should really be worried a lot about, because there are baseline effects, and it's clear to outline on what are the problems that will be causing that contraction. The key thing that we would have been worried is if we didn't know clinically about what is really causing some of these challenges. And I think the key thing really to see this is if you can pay attention for a moment on the slide that is showing up on the screen, particularly the one under 2020, because what we try to do there is to show the most important subsectors when one thinks about the agricultural economy in South Africa, primary agriculture. This is from a paper I wrote with Professor Johan Kirsten last year. What it does is just mapping you up. Your industry, of course, second largest when we think about the importance, but I think some of the most important industries like maize, citrus, deciduous fruits, they faced a number of challenges over the past few months, which is what adds on top of the baseline story that I was talking about to that contraction that we expect in agriculture this year. Let me speak a little bit as I head towards the closing of these remarks again about next season, because I think it's important. Francois, in his opening remarks, made an important thing about the changing climate. And from your side, on the RPO side, Gerard, I think the issues of animal diseases are likely going to be more prevalent. Again, I think it links back to Dr. Gideon's presentation, because the question I was asking him about how intense are the La Ninas, as well as the occurrence of the El Ninos as the opposite one, is a key thing that when I speak with many people, they are really worried about. The near-term outlook, it does indeed, from the South African, Australians, and the US, talk to another La Nina next year, the 2022-23 season. But I think what we should be worried a lot about is the intensity of that La Nina. We might actually see it being more intense than what we have seen this year, which was already a heavy rains, if you think about from October going on into the end of January, October last year, the end of January this year. And I think that's the most likelihood that we could see again this year. So the various diseases then in the livestock industry, piggery, that you experience in these times, I do think those are the things we should be worried a bit about. The other thing we might have to think about is the impact of that on your feeding industry, the guys in the grains. They might plant the usual area of 4.3 million hectares, but the tonnage, the quality of that, and all of those things are some of the factors we should really be thinking about deeply when we think about next year and the impact thereafter broadly on the livestock sector. And I emphasize this because if you look over the past few months, what is happening in the US, in Italy, Spain, China, there are all of these weather extremes. I mean, just about a few months ago in Kansas, there was about over 2,000 cattle that died over the heat stress. And we continue to see all of these things in parts of rural Spain. We hear about some of them in China. And I think then the opposite of that on the extreme is what we should really be worried about. And long term, when we are in the El Nino parts in South Africa, as well as our neighboring countries. So let me just make a closing remarks on the issues of policy, because I think that's where we spend a bit of time from an AgBiz side, and also my work partially in government stuff is largely on these things around about policy. And I think it's important when we think about long-term sustainability of this sector. And on the policy side, I mean, Gerard's presentation spoke directly onto these things. And the crux of the point that I want to pull up on his presentation was that the problems of South Africa's agriculture are clear. From a government side, I think they do understand them this time around, and everybody is clear about those. And from an AgBiz side, we rank them as those 5 points that you see there on that slide, which is broadly the inefficiencies in the state administration. And this is all that talks to Act 36, biosecurity, and all of those particular points. Infrastructure, with regards to our roads, the water infrastructure, the roads, and all of those things. And I think that is well understood. The issues of security is important. Even where I come from in the Transkei, we struggle with security, our stock theft and all of those things. And of course, even in the commercial farms, there's a lot of that, and farmer tax. And I think the most emerging and important one now is also the direct vandalization in South Africa's infrastructure. There seems to be organized crime on Transnet infrastructure, Eskom infrastructure, and all of that we do see, and it's affecting all of the industries. And I think that's something that is very important. At least now, even in the guys in Union Building are pretty much clear about the threats of that to the stability of the country. And I think it's a most serious thing, in addition, of course, to the agriculture-focused point. The other thing that I think is also understood, and it's turning positively, and I will speak on this in a moment as I close, is the issue of uncertainty that we've all in agriculture been talking about, land uncertainty and all of these things. And we've been doing a work in here for a while ago with the late, great Professor Mohammed Karan, Dr. Vuyo Mahlati, and many people that we've worked on this point for many years around the expropriations and all of those things. But I think the other important point, Gerald, you closed with this while you were also emphasizing the domestic market stuff, and even the Herald at BFEP spoke eloquently on this, is the issue of the research and the exports. You might have your own markets that you have identified for DeVault, but we think broadly for agriculture at AgBiz, the most important markets that needs to be added is Japan, is India, China, Saudi Arabia, and Bangladesh. And this is not specific to the red meat, but on agriculture, and saying what markets should you be adding to the pack of countries that we have. And I think the guys in government are also beginning to prioritize those points. The key thing then that is left now that everyone agrees, as all of us as South Africans on those points, is about how do you tackle them. And I think that working together, Yolanda, on your side with JFK, you speak a lot about these partnerships. And I think that's where the crux of the things needs to come on. And the master plan underlines those points of saying, what skills do we have? Where do we have a gap? How do we partner in each of those points? And I think that's where the discussion, and even the minister herself, I can speak for her on that point to say she agrees and she's open to partnering in these points. And that's the posture that we take also at AgBiz about all of those points that I've highlighted there. And I think the issue of exports beyond the livestock industry is particularly important when we think about growth of this sector. The figures I have, and I think my friends at BFEP have the same figures, is that we are now exporting roughly 51% of what we produce in value terms in South Africa. Last year, that was a good number, valued at about $12.4 billion of agricultural products. It means that if you look in our exports as a country, that's somewhere around about 8% of South Africa's overall exports coming out of agriculture. That's substantial, because even then in employment, that translates positively. Primary sector, we are employing about 860,000 people as this sector. You add agro-processing jobs onto that, they are around about 460,000 people that are also there. So combined, agriculture and agro-processing, you have roughly 1.3 million people or so that are dependent on this sector. So we are a valuable one when you think about the economy. Now that the numbers are looking like that, And the chart on your left-hand side, if you could look to it for a moment, it has that dark bluish bar that is there. That's where our exports are. If then we are about to follow Gerald's point on that BFEP had outlined about where those 5 pillars are, we will need to have some markets to push those products to. Otherwise, profitability will become an issue and a bit of saturation in the domestic market, which is why I think it's important. And I think it's important beyond Africa. I know when you listen to DTIC and the other guys, there's all of this story about Africa is important, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But the work we have done with Tinashe Kapuya, we turned out to be quite bleak about the whole Africa story, at least over the next decade. We think those markets I had outlined earlier on are more important than in the continent. In the continent remains an important market. 40% of our exports goes to Africa. But if you look where are they all concentrated, roughly 89% of them are within the SADC region. Outside, it's a few bits to Nigeria, a few bits to some countries. And then if you think about beyond that, there are logistical costs that are quite rife on getting those products there. And I think over the next decade or so, as I say, the work with Tinashe that we had done for academic purpose was not as promising on that point. But I think you colleagues, as I close, you've done amazingly. I mean, this is the beef exports. That number is likely going to be down, that green line this year. But I think the whole point is when we look at the RPO 2030 strategy that is on the agenda for today, the point is, yes, the number might come down for 2022, 23, but leading up to 2020, 30, that's that number that we need to increase. Because the bottom point is, while we say the domestic consumer is important, South Africans are under pressure. There is no income. They just can't afford some of the products that we're going to be producing. And I think then the issue of the exports become increasingly important in that, because you have households that completely just don't have any income. I see I am being told to conclude. I have 2 slides. Let me wrap up this point. These points are important. The point I want to close on is around the events of the past weekend at the ANC and the whole story around expropriation, and as to whether the people of the ANC understands if agriculture is important or not. I think they do. Officially in their reports, even dating from a paper they released, it's in their website, the new website, which is the ANC and something a number. They had an old website, but they forgot to pay for it and it was shut down. The new one has these documents. And the first point is what they say about agriculture, which is that agriculture remains an important sector of the South African economy. It seems like a simple statement, but it is important when it comes from someone that is a governing party of the country, because it is a policy suggestion and a posture about how our sector is viewed. And the second point they say is that when they think about land reform, they are thinking about the Land Reform Agency, Land Reform and Agriculture Development Agency, which could take agriculture forward. And they're putting an emphasis on an expropriation bill rather than on expropriation as a Section 25 debate that was ravaging across the country. And that agency, more work has already been done behind the scene, but the minister will speak for herself there about what the agency entails. But basically, it will be involving private sector participation as well as the public participation, and it will focus mainly, we think, around the land redistribution part. That land that Gerald talks about, the millions of hectares, it's some of those land supplies which will be under the agency, and the agency will begin to think about how do you select the right beneficiaries to benefit onto that. And they will do that not out of their own thinking, but there is a policy, beneficiary selection criteria policy, that will guide their decisions in thinking about that point. If we succeed on doing that, I think that begins to take away political pressure from other things. And my plea in the red meat industry, as we sit here, will be to that we have to try to support these PPP approaches, particularly related to risky things like land reform. Because if we support it and it goes successfully, then it takes away all of the other pressures that have kept us in a really bad shape over the past couple of years. because then it will mean that there's progress, there's new farmers that are coming in, the structure of our sector begins to change, pie get bigger, and changes nicely. And I think that's important, which is why I then added the issues around the master plan as the important levers that will guide us to go forward. So let me close by saying, if you remember anything in what I have said, it's perhaps maybe those 4 points that are in the screen, that the South African economy for the next 2 years or so, 2 to 3 years, we're likely going to be in bad shape. Supply chains disruptions will continue to be there, which means the cost of inputs that needs to be shipped will remain tough. Inflation will remain elevated. The cost of money, adding to the input costs that are already expensive, is what will make things tougher in the next term. The sector, we have sufficient food. We have done well. I think we are in fairly good shape. But I think the issue of La Nina and the intensity of it is something that we have to watch as we approach the next season. And lastly, it seems that the policy is changing to be positive, and I think we can lean on the master plan and the other instruments to combine our efforts in those partnership. Mr. Chairman and Gerard from RPO side, from AgBiz, we are thankful for the opportunity to speak. The slides will be made available if I ran quite fast on some. Thank you so much.
Wandile, thank you very, very much. Yeah, have a seat, please. You spoke a lot about policy, and you're a policy trend setter. We are very much at ease that you have direct and official inputs to the minister, but also be assured that when you give us policy directions, we as an organizations listen to that. So it's not a one-sided affair. I can assure you that PPPs will play a big part in Deewald's future and in the red meat industry, so we are there. Thank you very much for that. Again, a few questions, if you don't mind. We don't have enough time. We should have had more time, but thank you very much.